tell you how much I'm looking forward to this panel, but I also have to say that when I was asked to do it, nobody told me I'm getting the after lunch slot. And if that means that all of you are having a little bit of a, post-lunch snooze, or, the delicious carbs are settling into your tummies, I'm sure that we can keep the excitement up, because this is a very, very exciting subject. Now, can I have a show of hands? Who here, let's do a pub test. Imagine you're at the pub. Sorry, I live in London. Everything is about the pub. Imagine you're at the pub with your friends. How many of you would admit to your friends, oh, I'm really passionate about procurement? I'm getting a few hands. I like you already. But actually, when we think about procurement, it's easy to say, oh, it's this sort of heavy, slightly boring, slightly meticulous process. But what if we thought about procurement as an opportunity to define a relationship between two parties? What if we thought about procurement of startup services into our public services as an opportunity to together create a partnership, together create innovation? And where I live, which is the UK, public procurement represents £270 billion a year. And now when we think about the commercial opportunity it creates, and when we think about the amount of revenue that it could drive for much needed innovation, it really sort of reframes the question of how passionate we all should be about procurement. Now, who's going to raise their hand now? Who's passionate about procurement? I got like 3 more hands, yes. All right, excellent. I'm joined by the most wonderful panel. And one of the things that I love about it the most is that it's very, very global. So we'll be getting multiple different perspectives. And I'd like to start with Paola. Paola, if you could briefly introduce yourself, that'd be lovely.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for having us. I'm Paola Santana, and I'm the founder and CEO of Glass. We are building pioneering government e-commerce to bring the largest buyers in the world to actually buy seamlessly from the backbone of our country's economies, that are SMBs. I'm a Fulbright scholar, went to Washington, D.C. to study the future of governments through procurement, got a little bit frustrated, went into Silicon Valley, and ended up founding one of the first drone delivery companies in the world, basically building infrastructure and drone delivery, drone regulation, infrastructure for small businesses to get into the government market. I see everything as something that has missing pieces, and we just need to connect the dots. So that's what I'm doing, and happy to discuss procurement and innovation with you all.
Amazing, thank you. Over to you, Neil.
Cool. Yeah, first of all, wonderful to be here. Great location, wonderful to be in the city of The Hague with the GovTech Summit. I'm Neil Smith, co-founder and CEO of Alchemio. And Alchemio is a platform that has its mission to allow us to work better together to achieve change in the complex issues we face as society. We are a foundation. We're trying to put public values in the middle and bring, if you like, that whole conversation about public good and actually what is underlying the digital fabric, which actually we use to drive most of society at the moment, to bring that into the conversation. I have a background going from Ireland to America to London, a couple of startups at a scale up in Holland. And about 4 or 5 years ago, stepped out of that world, and I've been busy since then trying to see how that technical entrepreneurial background can be brought into play to move in whatever way we can the needle for where our society is going in terms of our future.
Amazing, thank you. Constantine.
My name is Constant van Oranje. I lead TechLeap. It's an organization to help improve the total climate for tech entrepreneurs in the Netherlands, to help them found and scale their businesses. I have a background in government, in consulting, and actually government, mostly the European Commission. So I've been on the procuring side, but also on the writing proposal side. So I've gone through the agony of procurement processes.
Amazing, thank you. Mikk.
Hi, thanks for inviting us here, and a really curious topic, and I hope we'll find different ways to analyze this. I'm Mikk from the government of Estonia. I've been working in the public sector for most of my career in research policy, in e-governance, but mostly in supporting the Estonian tech ecosystem through venture capital initiatives, ecosystem development, and lately, over the past few years, by building Accelerate Estonia, which is a government innovation lab aimed at building the bridge between the worlds that seem incompatible but as I hope to explain today, are not incompatible at all, but rather very good conversation partners in many meaningful ways.
Amazing. Thank you so much. All right, so let's jump into it. The tip is in the title of the panel. We're obviously going to be discussing barriers, but let's question this. How many barriers are there? Are there barriers? What's going on in your countries? And I want to start with Mikk. Obviously, Estonia, we're all looking at Estonia, the largest number of startups per capita. And, you have a chief technology officer in your government. I think that's terribly cool. We would think Estonia should get it right. So how is it? Procurement of startup services into public services.
Well, in Estonia, we like to think that public-private partnership is in our DNA, because that's the way we have been building our digital infrastructure for the past 25, 30 years. But I should admit that it's not in our DNA, especially when you want to tackle things that GovTech companies usually want to tackle, which are more also societal issues, environmental issues. There, we still have to nurture that conversation, and procurement is just one tool in our toolbox, and I would argue it's the most boring one, because it doesn't really lead to meaningful conversations. Rather, it leads to a transactional conversation, which means there's money in the game, which means that at least one partner of the conversation is in a defensive mode because they don't want to do mistakes. So therefore, we don't really operate ourselves within the team with procuring a particular service, but rather inviting companies to figure out what is actually the right question to answer in that space. It may not be so obvious from, say, a public tender that this is really the question that needs to be answered. Quite often it's rather a symptom of a much bigger problem, and why couldn't we just jump onto the bigger problem and refrain from working with symptoms when we can actually go to the root cause of the problem. This is what we try to do, and it's awfully difficult.
Yeah. Gentlemen, how is it in the Netherlands?
I think I'm not a procurer in the Netherlands, and so I don't know. But what I've seen in the last few years is that there is an enthusiasm for innovation in government. So on the one hand, you have how do you use procurement for innovation? So how can you support innovation, which is very difficult, SBIR kind of constructions. And I think there's been experimentation with that, but it's very hard for the startups often, and the relationship startups. Also, do you get paid in time? How is the bureaucracy to deal with? Especially if you're a smaller company, it's difficult. Difficult with large corporations, but it's particularly difficult with government. Then there is, are you using startups to improve government, which is another. They do meet in the middle somewhere, but for instance, the startup in residence programs that have been quite popular. But again, there, startups in residence, pilots, all these things are in the space at the fringe of government, and then it comes, how do you integrate it and scale it? And that, I think, is a big challenge everywhere. I think where at the city level, probably has been more success. Because I think the government is closer to the actual problems and the operators dealing with the problems. So there, the interaction with innovative ideas and with start and scale ups to integrate them into government activity and services has been greater. But I think the ambition is there. The pilots and the attempts have been made, but I don't think we're seeing kind of large scale deployments yet.
Okay. Neil, would you agree?
Yeah, sure. So obviously I sit on this side of the fence where we're trying to actually get the Alchemio platform into much wider usage. We've been very lucky since very early on with Alchemio to have the support of an organization like Digi Campus, which is a bridging organization like what you're doing. You have the world that is the public sector, has its own characteristics, which we can go into or not, and you have the startup world, and there's simply a very different speed, a very different culture, a very different attitude to what it takes to get stuff done. And these organizations that essentially bridge and bring trust between one world and another world are absolutely essential in actually giving the ability to connect in the right way and in the right avenues to actually make the relationships that are needed to get your solution actually in usage in the right environments. I'd love to see more of them. I'd love to see better funding from them. I think they're critical for it. But it's a very big sort of problem you're trying to attack with, at the moment, what I consider quite small resources that are being put in place to actually fund these bridging organizations. They're more the exception than the rule in terms of how they go in. There's a lot of programs out there, but there's not at the scale yet that I see to allow systematic engagement from the actual startup and innovation world into the public sector. The willingness is there, but the actual engagement is still a bit held on the outside.
Super interesting, thank you. Paola, what's it like in the US?
So what we see in the US is a lot of initiatives for innovation promoted by government for others, not for government. Which is interesting because very especially at the procurement and the centralized procurement and the Department of Procurements, they would want to implement policies as long as they are not the ones enforcing it. Which is interesting, is like, we want to optimize to spend between 20 to 30% of our procurement funds, and we want to funnel that towards small, medium enterprises, women-owned, veteran-owned, and whatnot. And it's almost like, oh, but that's an economic development department's job. It's not our job. Our job is just to make sure that things are compliant. So it's almost like if having an outcome-based procurement where you can have tangible results, it's something that everybody wants, but nobody wants to own and execute. And then this is where the gap comes in innovation, because it's on the nature of governments to be innovative. They have been the original pioneers. We were discussing this earlier. Like, governments created the first program that put the first human on the moon, right? And created the foundation for the internet and the GPS and funded most of these technologies, and that bought 80% of that technology that they funded. So they have done that already. The question is, when did we forget that we have done that? And why don't we want to assume that position again to be at the leadership of the change that we want to see from the innovation perspective?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is also a very effective tech transfer. And this is one of those problems that is very easily glossed over, because governments think innovation and there is, you can invest in research, and then somehow it ends up in the market. And some others think, there's procurement and you do that. These, and as Neil was saying, there is a trust issue, there's a speed issue, there are all kinds of processes. It's a highly, there's a lot of friction in that process, and it mostly kills the entrepreneur. They don't have money, they will get the wrong kind of money, so their cap tables get screwed up, and so basically you're not allowing these companies to grow and emerge. So if you want this as a government, same as with tech transfer. I've just been in MIT and I've seen what they've done, and at Flagship, that is the kind of the venture builder that built Moderna, highly successful. All of what they have in common is a really professional team to manage those relationships. So if you, as a government, you want this, you want procurement to help government innovate, then you have to understand that those relationships are complicated and you have to manage for them. And it just doesn't happen by themselves. So it's not just a policy field you can open. Let's go and do innovate or procure innovation or innovate in procurement. It's just not going to happen. You need to organize it. You need to create environments of trust. And otherwise, it is, I wouldn't say a waste of money, but it's definitely, money could be used much more effectively.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, no, and I just want to take up on that, procurement also has a bit of a reputation to focus a lot on price. And if you look at what a contract is actually for, a contract is for when trust breaks down. And if you actually have the trust working in a collaborative setup and you're jointly owning the problem and jointly making progress together, then actually a contract is just there for the safeguards if it breaks down. So procurement, if you look at it from point of view, actually giving the oversight and actually then looking at what the cost will be, I think we can also take it into a bit more richer focused, a little bit what you're saying, where you actually look at procurement in terms of driving value outcomes, whereby you're looking not just at price as one of the drivers for actually what it means to have a successful outcome, but what it means for the wider societal impact. What are the values behind the organizations that are actually bringing those services in? And I think procurement, if we can step up the procurement game by getting them to focus a lot more on the value generated over time, as opposed to the cost or the contractual pieces where they currently focus right now, I think we have a lot of value to gain.
And it's really interesting because you touch upon, I think, a certain themes are surfacing in terms of the things that are broken, and it feels like it's almost universal in our different countries. I want to pick up on the point of trust because you mentioned trust between, in this case, between the public sector and the startups and how that can be brokered with a contract. I also find it fascinating the trust and reputation that different public service agents carry within their institutions and what kind of risk they think they might have to take in order to procure from somebody who isn't a sort of traditional supplier. And a fascinating thing has been happening in the UK. I'm personally quite frustrated with the state of procurement of startup services in the UK. It's been quite difficult, and the majority of contracts, as far as I'm concerned, and what I'm hearing from founders I work with, go to the selected few suspects. But it was interesting what happened when COVID hit, because in COVID, suddenly there was no choice. There was no opportunity to, labor over certain points. We just had to very, very quickly almost reimagine our health services and then reimagine all of our services. And it felt like something's changed, and it felt like a certain sort of seal has been broken. But what I'm hearing from founders now is that at times it almost made things worse, because that didn't come with a cultural shift of wanting to take on that risk. And it's enough that one or two contracts went wrong, which they always would, and suddenly people are afraid to do it again because they're afraid for their jobs, they're afraid for their reputation, and they're afraid to be classed as this, risk taker who would do something that's a little bit silly. So when we go back to trust, sort of what are some of the other challenges that we can identify that are stopping us from, as you, Konstantin, as you mentioned, there is willingness. So if there is willingness and there is good innovation, and we, as Paula said, have a history of it working, then what are the bits that aren't working that are causing it to be as it is?
Well, trust comes in very, sometimes very unconventional ways. And sometimes to get the government to innovate, either through procurement or in other ways, looks kind of silly. For example, when I've asked different ministries, like, how do you choose which kind of innovation to support, then I've also heard the answer that if there's a person with high reputation in the society, if he says that we should do it, then obviously we're going to do it. So the tip for startups would be, like, find the person who the policymaker looks up to, convince them, and then everything becomes much easier, either through procurement or in other ways. But then again, sometimes we really kind of misunderstand how much of, well, for example, there was a startup that we currently work with, and they were kind of afraid to talk to the government because they thought that the government is kind of in a power position and can just impose whether this is going to be procured or they're going to build it in-house. And they were really, like, frustrated about this. But I knew from the other angle that the situation was vice versa, just the government didn't have enough trust in themselves. Therefore, they were, like, fluctuating and picking between different options, and they were really unsecure about what they should be doing. There was no power position at all. It was just a gross misunderstanding of where the conversation currently stands. And therefore, I think still again that the conversation should never be just about procurement. It should be about all the other options there as well.
Yeah, but I think what you're mentioning is the expertise in the government, knowing what you want. So the worst procurement is where you don't really know what you want, right? So you get into this messy process and it changes, and then or you want to pivot, and then the agent on the other side, at the government side said, but we didn't contract you for that, and then then you get into all kinds of troubles. And I think what's lacking often is deep expertise of how do you run big IT projects, and even how do you do service, as a service-oriented organization, the government, are they really thinking about how you serve the client and what it is that they procure, what's out there in the market. Often they don't know. So I think expertise is a big thing. I would actually flip it and say, well, if you are a startup, and when would you choose to work with the government? And if I would advise them and say, well, first, think twice, because it's going to be probably going to be a difficult client. But to look at very much, and who's on the other side? Is there someone who really wants to work with you because they have to support you? Because it's not just that person, but there are many layers behind and above them that needs to back them up. And so if you pivot, are you going to be backed? And 3, what's clear definition of the outcome? Because not the path where you go into, but the outcome. That's really important. And I think what's also important that you, if you engage in a pilot, that there is a clear path from pilot to deployment. So what I hear a lot of people doing, pilots, especially in healthcare, in many government space, in the public space, but it leads to nothing. And there's a lot of frustration because the startup believes, this is my launching customer. So I'm doing this pilot, and then there'll be a lot of things coming. But it could be that then you're just in the first gate of procurement, and then basically you're shut out of a second round procurement, or it doesn't scale because it's not, the pilot is not backed up by higher layers of government that really want the outcome to succeed. So you really have to think through as a startup, how does government work and how is the outcome of my work going to lead to real impact?
Super interesting. Guys, any other thoughts?
I would actually challenge that. I think every business should do business with government. Like, I would shift that. Like, if there are policies where government is trying to funnel money and distribute public investment, and of course, part of the problem is not trust, it's capacity building. So when I'm a small company, a startup, more innovative, more techy, more this, more that, and we are asking me to go from 0 to 100, like meaning apply for a contract and win it, when one of those requirements is past performance, I will never get there. However, and this is why we are obsessed with the small purchases for the small businesses, if we take small businesses from 0 to 1, and then this small business can get many ones, eventually, it's not just that you have past performance, it's that you talk to that government agency very often, is that you understand what are their incentives, is that you understand that they really want to optimize to buying local, buying small, buying from a women-owned business and whatnot. So capacity building is very important. Infrastructure for small businesses is also very important. I, as a small business, will make many mistakes. And the moment that we want to create an ecosystem where governments and startups meet in a non-experimental space is room for failure already, because again, if we are innovating, and this is something we have personally protested to many government agencies that say that they have an innovation program, I'm like, if it's innovative, I'm not saying you cannot outline some requirements, but I'm telling you that most likely the outcome, you have never experienced it before, nor you, nor anybody else. So can we leave some room to understand what is the problem? Can we leave some room to ask the right question here? Actually, if I'm a startup, can we agree that you don't know how to solve the problem and me neither, because nobody else has solved it? So if I come with the answers to the table, how much am I really innovating? Yeah. So we need to go very way back and say, someone needs to take some risk here. We need to change the culture in governments. Some people need to take the leadership and say, we're going to take some risk in this very specific environment with this very specific set of rules and this very specific set of startups. And then we need to take risks and do things little by little, but we cannot request things that we already know what the answer is, especially for startups. Else, again, is like we're always asking startups to innovate, but not with us.
Yeah. Cool. And if I
Sorry, just one quick remark on this. You mentioned past performance. It was quite funny to hear from one top-level policymaker in Estonia that he only wants to work with startups that have miserably failed in the past. Because then they know that this team has pushed beyond their limits, and they can be much more humbler, and they know how to navigate the government. And that was kind of surprising at the time to hear, but I'm really support what you just said, because this is actually, acknowledging on both sides that we are working on the limits here, and this is a really cool place to be.
Yeah. And just taking your point, I mean, one step back, the reason why we're talking about startups and procurement, engaging them in the public sector is because you want to achieve some change, right? You want to change something about how our current society is operating, or set some direction that we want to go in. So you're here and you want to go there, and you have to try and get the parties around the table who are actually going to work with you to achieve that change, right? Obviously, government should be a key partner. Obviously, startups can be an element in that solution, but it's in togetherness that actually you work together to achieve that change. And that is where the trust again comes back and the capability comes back, that you have to have the people. There's no point going on a trip with somebody where you're trying to, sail a boat across the ocean, and you find out you're the only sailor, right? You want to have all the people who actually have all the skills needed to achieve that goal you want to achieve. And that is maybe a point where it's still seen quite transactional, and we're going to go to the market, we're going to get a startup, and they're going to solve everything for us. No, it is a joint journey, it's a joint process, that we have to see it as that, togetherness actually going from here to there.
It's people, right? This is everything. It's all very simple. It's people. We always talk about systems, so systems of procurement, and of course you want the system to be ideal, and you want the procedures to be brilliant so that any nitwit can do it, but it's not the case. I mean, we hear something, as you're saying, we want to do something that's not there yet. Yeah. So you need risk, you need trust, all that. How do you manage risk and trust? It's people. Someone needs to step out there and needs to know that their back are covered, so that is not the little guy or girl that's doing the procurement that's going to be axed because they took a bit of risk. No, they want to know that somewhere high in the organization, we agree on an outcome. We don't know how to get there, so we create an environment where risk is permissible, and that I'm mandated to take that risk, and then it becomes, I'm a skilled person in this. I know how you do procurement. I know how innovation works and what the risks are. I know how to recognize a serious entrepreneur. Those are professional things you can learn over time, but very rarely we put those kind of people in that space and give them the mandate to actually do their job right.
Yeah, really interesting. And so much of the conversation seems to be about creating empathy for both parties and sort of collaboration and designing things together, rather than sort of coming at it from completely separate perspectives. And Konstantin, very quick question for you, because you said you've sat on both sides of this equation.
Yeah.
Do you feel that has put you in a special position to be able to, sort of, what's been your main learning from having done both?
Well, I'm actually, in my current job as well, I'm always a bit in between worlds, but things are so much easier if you have a shared ambition. So if there's and it doesn't really matter what it is, but if you know where you're going, you can organize around it. You're much more flexible in your system. But if you don't know where you're going, then it's a very different environment. So then you have to have a lot of trust, and you have to kind of come together and try to figure it out. And then once you've figured it out, there has to be a mechanism then to bring that to the next level. But we kind of very often confuse these things. So we think bottom up is good, and we don't need a vision. But we don't set a process, that organizes that. So it just we are throwing a lot of money at confusion, and then when it goes wrong, we blame someone. And as long as and I think that's the responsibility of good government, is that you first get an understanding about how this works, and then you put a set of rules in place where you can make it work, and then get the right people to do it. And then, create the environmental factors like trust and risk, but also execution, and then have milestones and say, well, you have actually achieved your milestone, now we're going to go for it. But I've seen so many good intentions, and actually also pretty good pilots that never went anywhere, because in the end, the politics move on. This was a project of the former minister, so it's no longer relevant, and it takes time, and we don't accept that. We want within 1 or 2 years immediate outcomes. No, it takes time. And especially what you're saying, this kind of more holistic approach. The externalities of a project can come years after, and they can have much more value than the actual project value. And if you're only doing price-based procurement, you're never going to get there.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about different challenges, and by the way, I would really like to encourage the audience to think about questions that you might have for the panel. We'll set some time aside for that. But let's talk about some solutions. Let's talk about things that work. And I'd love to start with Paula. Your startup exists to sort of broker that transition, and there's a number of agents in the space. Mikk, I'd love to hear from you later on sort of how your organization supports it. But yeah, what have we seen working? What case studies of success can we speak to?
I want to start with empathy. This is very interesting because I am obsessed with being pragmatic and having actionable things that we can put in the world and see like, hey, here's the data, like we are really moving the needle. But it's interesting how we all agree here that at the foundation of anything that we get done in government is people, right? So when I talk to procurement leaders, I receive many different answers. Many people say, like, look, I've been here 20 years. Now I'm a chief procurement officer. I'm not going to rock the boat. And that honesty of where they are and the realities that they need to deal with allows me to understand how to help that person from where that person is, not where I want them to be as a startup. I'm a startup, I get to experiment. No, no, no. And this is something I also talk to my team. We really try that everybody on the table do them. Like, we need the government to talk and think like government. We need the startup to talk and think like startup. We need the engineer to talk like an engineer and the designer to talk like as a designer, because everybody's seen at the same problem from different perspectives. And the beauty of that is that then I can approach my government counterpart and tell them, we are both trying to crack this problem. I'm gonna try to crack it by having 12 experiments this year, and you're gonna try to crack it by having a perfect plan. Can we meet in the middle? Let's do a six plans over the next 6 months, and we will have some milestones, but there's a lot of unknown in the middle, and I'm not gonna give you those metrics because I don't have them. So when we're able to have that open and closeness is very interesting, because in our case, we have a platform that enables governments to make small transactions in a very simplified manner, but every government that we're working with is optimizing for something different. Some government agencies like the city of Seattle, they're optimizing to improve the 20% they are already spending on small and medium businesses. They want more, they want to do, when we talk to them, they're like, I want 80%. And I'm like, well, that's pretty intense. Like, can we go little by little? And then you have the city of Oakley saying, I want to buy local. And then you have the town of Percival saying, I just want to digitize all my small businesses because they have no digital blueprint at all. So when we talk to every government, we say, okay, we can help you with technology, but we start from what is the challenge? Why haven't you been able to solve it? And is it because you have overplanned? And that's one of the reasons sometimes. And do you give us permission to experiment? And when they say yes, you can experiment, and we will be here seeing how you tackle this differently than we have tackled it, then we have an amazing relationship.
Amazing, thank you.
That does, I mean, this is great, but a lot of procurement rules are designed around avoiding corruption, nepotism, and all these things. And we dehumanize the procurement function, which is understandable. But whereas we are saying you have to put the human back into the system because it's about relationships, that is something that you have to be aware of. To come to that outcome where you say, I don't have a full plan, but I actually get to experiment and I get to build a relationship with the supplier because I want to learn as a procurer, I think that's gold. That's gold, but it is a challenge because our systems are not very well designed for that.
So do we have examples of where it worked?
Well, I just want to echo, tie onto that one, because there is a lot of work that has been done on what are the best practices to how to achieve a sort of collaborative, in it together kind of procurement process. There's a lot of knowledge out there. But how do you find it? Right? Where is it? How do you readily access it at the moment where you need it? And that's also a big gap. There's how to tap into all this body of knowledge that's out there to actually help these procurement processes to actually be that much more effective and to help guide us as we actually go on this discovery journey together to go from here to there. So I think we also, if you're looking at what can be done to help step up procurement, I think getting much better body of knowledge and guidance on how to do these innovation journeys, these innovation flows, is a critical thing, and we have to get that systematized and available. So if you find a fantastic process that happens to work in your environment, then you can get it available to everybody, right? And well, that's also too hard a thing. And then we fall back to actually locking it down, right? Because that's easy, and it's easy to lock stuff down, but it's hard to open it up.
So maybe two things that have worked in our environment. First of all is discipline, that again, the work of GovTech startups and government needs to be disciplined, which means in practice that it's incremental innovation week in, week out. For every couple of weeks with teams, we focus on 3 things, even if they're really small, that definitely need to get done for us to move the needle just a little bit further on. And this needs to happen from month to month to month until the end of the pilot to make sure that we're not falling off the train, so to say. And the second, I guess, is sometimes you have to create the urgency. If things start to look a little bit dull, then it's also easy to kind of lose the momentum. And sometimes, and that's painful. Getting to that urgency is painful because that means that the pilot is on fire, and that's not a good place to be, but that really unleashes creativity on both sides and also brings the teams to a much better support from the government, or then a clear understanding that this pilot is going nowhere, it's best to spend my money elsewhere.
Yeah. What's the role of accelerators or other sort of projects or institutions in this space? Like, is it on the startups to figure out how to best understand the projects that they're bidding for? Is it only on the government to educate themselves, or should we be just accepting that there is a slice of that pie that should be occupied by somebody who translates between the requirements of the two?
Well, I'm happy to take a piece of that pie because I do think that translation is needed. And again, we don't call ourselves as an accelerator. It's about accelerating Estonia, not a particular team, but a particular problem that gives Estonia both economic and socio-economic value. And obviously, as you mentioned as well, all of the successful programs out there in the history over the past at least 100 years are in cases where this transfer is managed really, really well. And we try to be really agnostic of what's the particular policy domain or what is the technology that's going to be implemented. That doesn't really matter. What really matters is getting to solve the right problem. And that really does need to be managed because it's not so obvious. The trust is, for starters, it's never there. You need to build it step by step. So yes, there is a place for that transfer, and happy to be a part of that.
Amazing. I'm sure the team at Public will be happy to hear that too, given that that's what the guys have been doing for a long time, sort of trying to bridge that gap. And it's interesting on the accelerator side. Something that I thought worked quite well in the UK. So at Google, I co-lead a fund that invests in black-led startups, and one of the most successful companies we invested in is a company called Sovera. They are a telemedicine company, but it's a company that was founded by a young doctor who was part of an accelerator that was done within the NHS. And it was a program that took young doctors, and they were able to come up with a problem that needed solving, and within the system of the NHS continue their medical training and work on that problem. And now Ivan is incredibly well placed to understand the challenges of the NHS, knows how both sides work, and is doing fantastically well. So I think also that's another interesting piece on how we could be using sort of these programs within the public sector. Yes.
Yeah, no, and I just wanted to tie on to the point from Mikk that, actually I love the description. You're an accelerator for getting solutions to problems, as opposed to the classic accelerator, we're going to accelerate a startup, right? Which is all well and good, but ultimately that's the problems we need to solve as society. A problem accelerator or a solution accelerator. And I think if we can turn the terminology and put the focus to that kind of acceleration and that kind of, putting our energy in that direction, I think we can have a lot of value for society.
Yeah, it all comes back to what Paula said. In the American government, you doing procurement for startups, out there. If you're not the problem owner, then it's never going to be a sincere process. And actually, we had this discussion a few weeks ago with our Minister for Health, and he also said, why isn't, but we have so many health startups, but why aren't they scaling? And what can the government do? And say, well, the government can't do very much. I mean, of course, you can get a better procurement system, and you can have more capacity, so for clinical trials and all that. But really, the problems of the healthcare system in the Netherlands are not going to be solved by Dutch startups. You can procure the solutions all over the world. So it's not there that you have to. So they don't have to stay in the Netherlands. A successful health tech startup should go to the US, and because it's a much bigger market. So I said, but what you could do, if you want to procure, look at what systems issue you have, the throughput, you have your electronic patient records, but you have all kinds of issues and inefficiencies in the healthcare system that can be overcome by innovative solutions. But it's you that need to define what your problems are, and then you can procure innovation from startups, etc. But don't procure, don't try to offer kind of your system for all startups to grow, because that's not going to work. So I think it comes back to the same thing. The government needs to be the problem owner, needs to want this. And once they want it, they have to put in the right processes to actually be able to do it, so that the startup can deliver. Then, of course, the startup themselves have to acknowledge what it is to work with government and understand, what the issues are that the procuring officer might have. But it does, for me, always starts with the government being the problem owner and being very serious about wanting startups to provide innovative solutions that they didn't foresee themselves.
I think one pro tip for all the GovTech startups would really to make sure that the person who seems to be the owner really is like genuine. If you test that first, then you've done a good job for yourself.
Yeah. And actually, I want to, amazing discussion. Thank you so much for all your contributions. And I want to make sure that I honor what I said I would do, which is taking some questions from the audience. And one of them is exactly about the role of the startup. What we've got here is, if a relation is not working, it is often caused by both sides. What can innovators or startups change in their behavior in relation to this issue? What are startups getting wrong?
I think that having more structured but open conversations helps a lot. With the Agency for Digital Innovation in Mexico City, very specific, amazing use case that they pioneered and they saw it, that we, being procurement experts with tech, couldn't see, is that they were saying, if we help purchasing units to better frame what they want to buy or what problem they're trying to solve, and before they issue the final solicitation, if we can open it up in a draft mode, and the draft not being a PDF, the draft being an interactive piece of document where any citizen, but very specifically any startup or a small business, can actually highlight and say, there is a problem with this requirement. This technical requirement is more, less of that what's in the market, or this is something nobody can do, or at least we don't even understand what you mean by this thing. When you have those conversations in the early stages of forming this document, that is the thing that is gonna imply a contract or whatnot, they started publishing like one of these PDFs and having 3 responses, and the last time I checked the platform that we co-created with them, they were having like 54 comments from, you had like a big car manufacturer and also like a small mechanic shop also making a comment of, this is not something we can do within 24 hours. So by the time something you try to implement a pilot, it's not a surprise that everybody told you. And of course, it's cool because it's not, the procurement officer doesn't have to take the comment. So it doesn't need to impose on the contract what people say, but it shows to the person that made the comment or to the vendor that made the comment that the comment was viewed. So, and was considered and implemented or not. So I think that it's more about doing the prep work of understanding where we are and where we want to go, and when you say this, is that what you mean? When I say this, is this what I mean? Then it's just, it goes back into an innovation process where I go back to culture. How comfortable is government with starting things that they don't know what's the outcome? And another way to make this, to ask this question is, how many government people that are sitting here have done, it's going to be November, have done 10 experiments this year? Have you done 2? Have you done 3? Well, no, because we like plans, we don't like experiments. So when something doesn't work, you were not expecting it not to work because you don't think in that way. So.
That's incredible, huh? The whole government is kind of fixed. We all know it's not working very well, but we all know that's how it works. And the government will explain, it's like a big black box, so we'll explain to everybody how it works, and then it stops. Whereas this, what we're talking about now, is you want to actually improve it. So a learning culture on both sides, but the startup is basically one little dot of many that the government is interacting with. And so, but to introduce a learning culture also in a big corporate, in a big organization, is a real challenge. But we know it's necessary. Just that the government is a monopolist. They don't really need to. If they don't do it, then it's still the government. Nobody's going to remove them. So I think to do that requires, it's a cultural shift, and that you are curious about your suppliers. It means that you're curious about what citizens want, and you're reaching out there. It's pretty profound, and I think so. We often take procurement as a part of this, but it is embedded in a wider culture of government. That if it doesn't have that kind of learning capability, and if it doesn't kind of want to do experiments to actually learn and to improve, but that if the individual procurement officer, when he or she wants to do something new, actually gets hit on the head again and say, well, just do what you do, what we always have done, then it's never going to happen. So I do think there's also a message here towards leadership in government, that it's much more also about a broader culture of learning and wanting to improve.
Yeah, but also recognizing that, what you're saying is that you have to take the time at the start to understand you're here. You think you want to go there, right? But that journey, actually, your destination might actually be a bit over there, and maybe you need different people with you and a different set of skills to get there. And but if you actually take the time to understand what that journey looks like, and actually who and what is needed to get there, then you actually have the alignment, which comes back to your question, to say that actually we understand where we're trying to go, and hopefully then there's less opportunity for these misunderstandings to come through, because you both, as a set of parties, understand what that journey is about and actually what you're going to do to try and get there.
And one last thing is a sense of urgency. We're not talking about, we're talking about the biggest decision makers in the world. So a small business, a restaurant business, a small startup, if something is not working for 7 days in a row, you would change it with a sense of urgency. Do I need to change the menu? Do I need to change the chef? Do I need to change the color of the chairs? Like, you have a sense of urgency because you depend, and people depend, on making decisions so that business is open. How can it, and that's a restaurant. That's just a restaurant, right? How can it be that the main provider of healthcare, education, public basic infrastructure doesn't have a sense of urgency to change things that are not working, that affect how we live and thrive every day? So we need to remind our leaders and work with them hand by hand about the sense of urgency that we need to help them do what they need to do.
And I think that sense of urgency is a very beautiful point on which to finish. Time really flew, and I'm really sad that we've come to an end of our time, but I will say we've gone nowhere near through the list of questions, which, by the way, means you guys are all quite passionate about procurement. Hopefully conversations can carry on into the breaks. Thank you so much for all your contributions. And I hope that everybody we here represent an actual